The federal courtroom in Chicago felt colder than it should have. Not physically, structurally. Marble floors, high ceilings, the kind of lighting that flattens faces and exposes flaws. Sound carried too easily in that room. Every shuffle of paper, every exhale, every whisper that tried to be discreet and failed. I sat at the defense table, spine straight, hands folded loosely in front of me. My suit was navy, conservative, intentional, the same shade as the dress uniform I had once worn under very different lights. Across the aisle, my father stood beside his attorneys. Robert Hayes, CEO of Hayes Corporation, architect of acquisitions, a man who built his reputation on decisive language and controlled outcomes. He wore confidence like a tailored coat, perfectly fitted, rarely wrinkled. The gallery was fuller than it needed to be for a preliminary hearing. Reporters lined the back row. 2 financial analysts I recognized from televised panels sat near the aisle. 3 board members were positioned carefully behind him, as if proximity alone could shield them from whatever this was becoming. He had arranged this, not illegally, not theatrically, strategically. This was never just about the case. It was about optics. When the judge invited opening statements, my father rose slowly, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate calm. He didn't look at me at first. He looked at the room. He understood rooms. "Your Honor," he began, voice smooth, measured, persuasive, "this is an unfortunate but necessary matter." Unfortunate. Necessary. He spoke about fiduciary responsibility, about corporate governance, about stability. He referenced my unauthorized communications and reckless procedural deviations. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The implication was clear. I had jeopardized the company. I had acted impulsively. I lacked discipline. A faint murmur moved through the gallery at carefully placed moments. He paused just long enough to let them process each accusation. He knew how to build agreement without asking for it. Then he turned toward me. "Madison," he said, the faintest smile touching his mouth, "you're finished." He meant professionally, socially, publicly. He believed he had already won. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. I felt the weight of eyes on me, waiting for reaction, waiting for fracture. I didn't give them either. I had stood in briefing rooms where the air was thick with consequences, where a miscalculation meant more than embarrassment, where silence wasn't awkward, it was operational. A federal courtroom does not intimidate someone who has waded through classified pauses that stretch like wire. I looked at him. "You don't even know who I was in the Navy," I said quietly. Not sharp, not defensive, just true. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. My father's smirk deepened, mistaking composure for deflection. "This isn't about military theatrics," he replied lightly. "This is about business." Business. He thought pressure was quarterly earnings. He thought authority came from market capitalization. He had no framework for the kind of pressure that strips ego from a person and leaves only competence. I didn't argue. I didn't correct his timeline, even though I knew precisely where it bent around inconvenient facts. Weeks earlier, when internal compliance reports first crossed my desk, I had done what I was trained to do: observe, verify, document. Hayes Corporation had always operated at the edge of aggressive legality. That was part of its mythology. My father called it innovation. I called it exposure. There were inconsistencies in offshore investment vehicles, delayed audit responses, subsidiary revenue reports that didn't reconcile cleanly with Treasury filings. Nothing explosive on its own, but patterns matter, and I had been trained to see patterns where others saw noise. I had not leaked anything. I had not accused him publicly. I had asked questions, structured, documented questions. He interpreted that as betrayal. The truth is more inconvenient. He interpreted it as loss of control. As he continued speaking, I let my breathing slow deliberately. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Pressure is not about volume, it's about containment. He concluded with a summary designed to seal perception. "My daughter," he said, emphasizing the word in a way that suggested disappointment rather than relation, "is out of her depth." There it was, the narrative. Emotional, unstable, inexperienced, finished. The judge nodded for procedural acknowledgement, and that's when the courtroom doors opened. The sound was subtle, just the click of metal and wood, but trained ears recognized shifts in environment. A uniform entered the room, not ceremonial, not decorative. Dress whites, precision pressed, command presence that does not need introduction. He walked down the center aisle without haste, without hesitation. Conversations thinned into silence. Cameras lowered instinctively. Even my father paused mid-adjustment of his notes. The officer stopped beside my table. I did not turn immediately. I knew the cadence of those steps. "Commander Hayes," he said clearly. The room inhaled. He rendered a formal salute, not for spectacle, for protocol, for record. I stood, returned the salute. "Captain," I replied. The word commander echoed louder than any accusation that had been spoken that morning. My father blinked. The judge straightened slightly in her chair. The captain lowered his hand and placed a slim, sealed folder on the table in front of me. "I am present to verify service record and federal clearance status relevant to these proceedings," he said evenly. Relevant. Not emotional, not symbolic, procedural. My father's expression shifted for the first time. Not panic, disorientation. He had built his case on the assumption that he understood the full scope of my identity. He had not asked. He had not needed to. He assumed it was irrelevant. The captain addressed the court. "Commander Hayes operated under classified directives requiring sustained operational oversight and strategic compliance with federal law. I am authorized to confirm her record of command and procedural discipline." Procedural discipline. The same phrase my father had implied I lacked. The silence in the courtroom thickened. No one laughed now. No one murmured. The judge requested a brief recess. Chairs scraped the marble floor. Reporters began typing rapidly. My father leaned slightly toward me, voice low. "What is this?" he asked. Not angry, uncertain. "You built your argument on reputation," I said quietly. "I built mine on record." He searched my face for anger, triumph, something he could dismiss as emotional. There was none. Unlike him, I understood pressure. Unlike him, I knew when to speak and when silence does the work. And I hadn't even opened my files yet. Recess did not sound like relief. It sounded like containment. The judge's gavel struck once, controlled and neutral, but the room fractured immediately into low voices and sharp movement. Reporters rose first. They always do. Chairs scraped. Phones lifted. A court officer stepped between tables to manage proximity, as if physical distance could restore narrative order. I remained standing for a moment longer than necessary. The captain had stepped back but not away. His posture remained formal, hands clasped behind him, eyes forward. He was not there for me personally. He was there for protocol. That distinction mattered. My father did not stand immediately. He looked smaller, seated, not diminished, but recalibrating. I had seen that look before in boardrooms when an acquisition target produced unexpected leverage. He rose slowly. "What clearance?" he asked, voice low enough to avoid microphones but sharp enough to cut. I met his gaze without turning fully toward him. "Enough," I said. His jaw tightened. He disliked incomplete information more than opposition. "You're escalating this," he said. "No," I replied evenly. "I documented it." "There is a difference." He glanced at the sealed folder in front of me, then at the captain's insignia. He was calculating exposure now, not dominance. Behind him, one of the board members whispered urgently to another. I caught fragments. Verification. Federal involvement. Oversight. The word oversight travels quickly in financial circles. The captain leaned slightly toward the judge's bench as a clerk approached. Papers exchanged hands, quiet confirmations, official language, the machinery of federal procedure moving with unhurried certainty. I did not open the folder, I did not need to. The power of it was not in its contents, but in its existence. Across the aisle, my father's lead attorney adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "We were not informed that military credentials were relevant to this proceeding," he said carefully to the court officer. "They are now," the officer replied. I almost smiled. Pressure is not about aggression, it is about timing. My father stepped closer. "You're enjoying this," he said. It wasn't a question. I looked at him fully then. "No," I said. "I warned you." Weeks earlier, in his corner office overlooking the Chicago River, I had placed a compliance summary on his desk. There were discrepancies in international fund transfers routed through a subsidiary registered in Luxembourg. Nothing overtly illegal at face value, but layered. Layered structures invite scrutiny. "You're overreacting," he had told me then. "I'm flagging risk," I corrected. He had waved the document aside. "I built this company," he said. "You think I don't understand risk?" I understood something he did not. Operational risk and reputational risk are not the same, and federal attention does not arrive loudly. It arrives quietly and stays. Back in the courtroom, reporters were already outside the doors. I could see them through the narrow glass panels, clustered, phones raised. The first headline would not mention my clearance. It would mention uncertainty. Markets dislike uncertainty. The judge returned sooner than expected. Recess had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had shifted the room's center of gravity. Everyone stood again. The captain resumed his position behind me, not touching the table, not interfering. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked directly at my father. "Given new verification regarding Commander Hayes's federal service record," she began, "the court will review additional documentation before proceeding further." My father's attorney stepped forward. "Your Honor, with respect, this case concerns corporate governance." "And federal compliance may intersect with that governance," she replied calmly. "Intersect. A neutral word with consequences." My father inhaled slowly, visibly containing himself. Public anger would serve no purpose now. The judge continued, "I am ordering a temporary pause on internal disciplinary actions against Commander Hayes pending review." Pause. That word landed heavier than any accusation. He had intended today to finalize my removal from the board, to isolate me legally and socially. Instead, he had been told to wait. Waiting is unfamiliar terrain for men who command. The hearing adjourned for the day. No gavel this time, just procedural closure. As people filtered out, the soundscape shifted from confident murmur to speculative tension. 2 reporters approached immediately. "Commander Hayes, can you clarify the nature of your clearance?" "No," I said. "Is there a federal investigation into Hayes Corporation?" "I'm not authorized to comment." Which was true. My father brushed past them without answering. His composure was intact. Barely. Outside, Chicago wind cut sharply between buildings. Cameras flashed. Microphones extended like small, insistent weapons. He turned to me once more before stepping into his car. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," I replied. It wasn't a threat. It was a shared understanding. By the time I reached my own vehicle, my phone had begun to vibrate repeatedly. Unknown numbers, board members, 2 journalists whose names I recognized from financial exposés, and 1 message from an internal compliance officer. "We need to talk." That message mattered more than the rest. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. For years, my father had controlled narratives by moving first, by announcing outcomes before anyone could question them. Today, he had been forced to react. That shift would not stay contained. By late afternoon, the first article went live. Hayes Corporation Board tensions surface in federal court. Neutral headline, measured tone. But between the lines, doubt. By evening, a second piece referenced previously undisclosed audit concerns. I had not spoken to any journalist. I had not released a single document. Patterns draw attention on their own once light touches them. At 7:42 p.m., I received a call from a board member who had remained silent during the hearing. "Madison," he said, voice strained, "is there exposure we're not aware of?" "There are questions," I replied. "Are they answerable? Yes? Are they survivable?" That question lingered. "If addressed properly," I said. Silence. "I think we need an internal review," he muttered. Control was shifting. Not because I forced it, because uncertainty demands process. My father had built his life on decisive control, on closing rooms, shaping outcomes, dismissing doubt before it matured. But federal systems do not respond to charisma. They respond to documentation. That night, as headlines multiplied, I finally opened the sealed folder. Inside were verification letters, clearance confirmation, a concise summary of my operational command history, redacted heavily but unmistakable in implication, strategic oversight. Regulatory compliance enforcement, joint federal coordination. In other words, I was trained to identify procedural breaches and escalate appropriately. I had done exactly that. My phone vibrated again. This time, it was my father. I let it ring twice before answering. Madison. No title, no accusation, just my name. "What do you want?" I asked. A long exhale. "We need to align before this spirals." Align. He still believed this was negotiation. "It's already in motion," I said. "You could stop it." I didn't start it. Another silence. For the first time in my life, I heard something in his voice that did not belong to authority. Uncertainty. And uncertainty, once visible, spreads. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. I closed my eyes briefly. "Yes," I replied. "Not vindictive, just accurate." Outside my window, Chicago traffic moved as it always did, indifferent, relentless. Empires do not fall in explosions. They erode at pressure points, and his began the moment that salute cut through the courtroom air. Control doesn't disappear all at once. It loosens, quietly. The morning after the hearing, Hayes Corporation stock opened down 3%. That wasn't catastrophic. Not yet. Markets fluctuate. Analysts speculate. Headlines exaggerate. But volatility is contagious. By noon, it was down 7. Financial news panels began using words like uncertainty, governance tension, and internal review pressure. They didn't have hard evidence. They had movement, and movement invites interpretation. I watched it from my apartment, not from the boardroom. For the first time in years, I wasn't inside the building when panic began to circulate through its hallways. I imagined the elevators, executives stepping out with tightened expressions, assistants whispering, compliance officers suddenly very busy. My phone buzzed again. Internal legal, urgent. Call back. I let it ring. Then another message. Audit committee chair. We need clarity immediately. Clarity. That word always surfaces when narrative control fractures. At 2:13 p.m., a national outlet published a longer piece. This one referenced delayed disclosures in 2 overseas subsidiaries. It cited anonymous sources familiar with internal discussions. I didn't know who spoke. I didn't need to. Once a crack appears, pressure widens it. At 3:05 p.m., I received a call from the compliance officer who had texted me the night before. "Madison," she said, skipping pleasantries, "did you provide documentation externally?" "No." A pause. "They're asking for internal preservation of records." "Who is?" "Federal inquiry. Preliminary." There it was. Preliminary inquiries do not make headlines immediately. They move through formal channels first, quiet letters, document retention requests, structured questions. My father had spent decades advising clients how to survive these moments. He never imagined being on the receiving end. At 4:30 p.m., the board scheduled an emergency virtual meeting. I logged in without turning on my camera at first. 12 small rectangles filled the screen. Tension has a visual language. Tight jaws, clipped speech, eyes flicking toward unseen advisors. My father joined last. He did not greet anyone. "We need alignment," he began, the same word he had used with me. "We are facing reputational noise amplified by misunderstanding." Noise. He was still framing it as optics. The audit chair interrupted. "It's not just noise, Robert. We've received notice of record preservation requirements." Silence. Even through screens, silence expands. My father's expression hardened. "That's procedural." "So is scrutiny," another director replied. I listened. For years, I had been the youngest voice in that room, the one asked for perspective but rarely granted authority. Today, no one interrupted me when I spoke. "The discrepancies I flagged 3 weeks ago remain unaddressed," I said evenly. "We can either conduct a transparent internal review now or wait for external findings to define the narrative." No one called me emotional. No one questioned my discipline. Titles matter. Salutes matter. But documentation matters more. My father looked directly into the camera. "You're suggesting we investigate ourselves based on incomplete context." "I'm suggesting we respect process," I replied. He leaned back slightly. "Process can be weaponized." "Yes," I said, "by those who ignore it." The meeting lasted 90 minutes. By the end, a vote was taken. Independent external auditors would be retained immediately. An internal governance review committee would be formed. My father opposed both measures. He was outvoted. That was the first real fracture. After the call ended, my phone rang again. Him. I answered. "You forced this," he said. "I documented risk," I replied. "You could have handled it privately." I tried. His breathing was slower now, not angry, calculating. "Do you understand what you're doing to this company?" "Yes." "And you're comfortable with that?" "I'm comfortable with compliance." Silence. For most of my life, silence had belonged to him. He used it as leverage, as judgment, as dominance. Now it belonged to me. By evening, another board member announced publicly that he would welcome transparency to restore investor confidence. Investors noticed tone shifts faster than facts. 2 institutional partners requested meetings. 3 senior managers began updating their resumes. Control was no longer centralized. It was diffused, and diffusion is what weakens empires. The press cycle intensified on day 3. Headlines sharpened. Hayes Corporation faces governance questions. After courtroom revelation. Courtroom revelation. They weren't referring to any document. They were referring to the salute. Symbolism moves faster than spreadsheets. The image circulated online, me standing beside a uniformed officer, posture straight, expression controlled. Commentators debated what it meant: integrity, oversight, federal entanglement. My father called again that night, not as CEO, as father. Madison, just my name, no title, no accusation. "I need to know if there's more," he said. "More what?" "More exposure." "There's more documentation," I said. "Have you shared it?" "No." "Will you?" "That depends." On process, on transparency, on whether he continued resisting review or embraced it. He exhaled slowly. "I built this from nothing," he said. I had heard that sentence since childhood. Brick by brick, deal by deal, control by control. "I know," I replied. "And you're willing to watch it collapse?" I looked out at the city lights below my apartment window. "I'm willing to watch it correct." Correction feels like collapse to those who mistake expansion for invincibility. On day 5, the board initiated a formal vote of confidence. Not in me, in him. It passed. Barely. Publicly, that looked like stability. Privately, it signaled vulnerability. By day 7, 2 major partners announced they were evaluating strategic alignment. Translation: distancing. The empire wasn't falling in flames, it was shedding certainty. My father requested a private meeting, neutral location, no attorneys, no board members. I agreed. We met in a quiet conference room overlooking the river. No cameras, no reporters. He looked older, not physically weakened, structurally unsettled. "You've always been disciplined," he said, not a compliment, an observation. "You taught me that," I replied. He almost smiled. "This wasn't supposed to happen." "Neither was non-compliance," I said gently. He stared at the table for a long moment. "For the first time," he said slowly, "I'm not controlling the variables." That was it. The admission. Control slipping. Reversed roles. He had spent decades shaping reputations, structuring deals, managing perception. Now he was reacting. Now he was asking. And I wasn't retaliating. I hadn't released everything I knew. I hadn't exposed every vulnerability. I didn't need to. His collapse began the moment truth entered that courtroom with a military salute. Sometimes strength is restraint. Sometimes power is patience. And sometimes empires fall not because someone attacks them, but because they can no longer withstand the weight of their own unchecked certainty. The collapse did not announce itself. There was no dramatic resignation, no flashing red ticker declaring the end of Hayes Corporation, no agents at the door, no handcuffs. It was quieter than that. It began with language. Strategic reassessment, temporary restructuring, leadership transition review. When powerful men fall, the words around them grow softer. 3 weeks after the hearing, the independent auditors released a preliminary summary to the board, not to the press, not publicly, but leaks travel faster than official statements. Improper disclosure timing, inadequate subsidiary oversight, risk exposure beyond stated thresholds, nothing criminal yet, but enough to fracture confidence. The stock dipped again, not sharply this time, steadily. Investors don't panic immediately when foundations crack. They reposition. The first senior executive resigned on a Friday afternoon, personal reasons. The second followed the next week, personal alignment. By the end of the month, the board called an emergency session without my father present. I received the calendar invite at 6:12 a.m. Subject: executive continuity discussion. He called me at 6:19. "Are you attending?" he asked. "Yes." A pause. "They're moving faster than I anticipated." "Yes," I said again. He exhaled slowly. For the first time in my life, he sounded tired. Not theatrically tired, not burdened for effect, just human. "I need to know where you stand," he said. It wasn't a command, it was a request. "With the company," I replied. "No," he said quietly, "with me." That question lingered. For years, I had stood across rooms from him as the underestimated daughter, the one he corrected publicly, the one he believed required management. Now he was measuring something else. I chose my words carefully. "I stand with process," I said, "and accountability." He didn't argue. The emergency session lasted 2 hours. The independent auditors presented findings. The legal counsel outlined exposure scenarios. The external communications advisor projected potential reputational trajectories. When it ended, a vote was called. Temporary removal of CEO authority pending full review. Not termination. Not yet, but suspension. 9 votes in favor, 2 against. I did not speak during the vote. I did not need to. When the decision was communicated to him, he did not shout. He nodded once. "I understand," he said. Understanding is different from agreement. His name began appearing in headlines with new language. CEO steps aside. Amid governance questions. Board initiates leadership review. The tone was restrained, but the implication was unmistakable. Control had shifted. He asked to see me that evening, Not at headquarters, not in a boardroom, at his house. I hadn't been there in months. The house looked the same from the outside. Perfect landscaping, controlled symmetry, the illusion of permanence. Inside, he was alone. No assistants, no advisors, no performance. He stood in the living room where he used to host investors and political donors, where he once told me I was out of my depth. "You didn't retaliate," he said. "No." "You could have." "Yes." The admission hung between us. He walked to the window and looked out at the manicured lawn. "For years," he said slowly, "I believed strength meant never conceding ground." I didn't interrupt. "I built everything on certainty," he continued, "on decisive control." "And?" I asked quietly, "and I mistook resistance for disloyalty." There it was, not a full apology, but a recognition. "You weren't attacking me," he said. "You were correcting exposure." "Yes." He turned toward me. "And I tried to destroy you for it." The words were clinical, not emotional, accurate. "You tried to protect your position," I replied, "from my own daughter." "Yes." Silence filled the room, but it wasn't hostile. It was reflective. "I underestimated you," he said again. "You did." He almost smiled at the directness. "For the first time," he added, "I don't know how to regain control." That was the core of it. Not reputation, not money. Control. "You don't," I said gently. "You adapt." He studied my face. "You're not enjoying this." "No." "You don't hate me." "No." That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. "Why?" he asked. "Because revenge is loud, and I have lived long enough in loud rooms, because I understood pressure before he ever did, because collapse is inevitable when truth enters a system that refuses correction, and because I didn't need to win. I don't need you to fall," I said. "I needed you to see." He looked down at his hands. For decades, those hands signed deals worth millions, directed expansions, closed acquisitions. Now they rested empty on the table. "Is there a path back?" he asked. "For the company?" I clarified. "For me." I considered that carefully. "There's always a path," I said, "but it won't look like what you built." He nodded slowly. The board later announced an interim CEO, external, neutral, stability through distance. My father remained on administrative leave pending final review. The headlines softened further. Transition, governance reform, internal strengthening. Empires don't collapse in explosions. They recalibrate, or they dissolve. Weeks passed. The investigations remained administrative, not criminal. Corrective actions were implemented. Structural reforms announced. Public trust stabilized. My father's role was reduced permanently. Advisory capacity only. No executive authority. He did not fight it. That surprised many people. It didn't surprise me. Once a man truly understands pressure, he recognizes when resistance becomes self-destruction. He called me one last time before the final restructuring announcement. "I thought power was dominance," he said. "It's responsibility," I replied. "I tried to humiliate you." "Yes, and you didn't humiliate me back." "No." "Why?" I thought of the courtroom, the salute, the silence, because I didn't have to. Sometimes all it takes is reminding someone who you really are, not loudly, not angrily, just factually. His empire didn't fall because I attacked it. It shifted because truth entered a room he believed he controlled. Strength without revenge is unsettling to those who expect retaliation, but it is also final. He underestimated his own daughter, and the moment he realized it, control was never his again.